My name is Shannon Wilbur, and I am an attorney. And right now I work as the Youth Policy Director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights.
I'm Lori Mattioli, and I'm a nurse case manager working with people living with HIV.
My name is David Weissman, and I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I also am the co-founder and co-programmer of a queer documentary film festival here in Portland. And I lived in San Francisco from 1976 through April of 2013, and have lived in Portland part-time since 2004. So all during those years in San Francisco, I was very involved in gay politics, gay community, gay culture, and all of the events that happened during those years.
So my name is Jessica, and I identify as just a queer woman, and I work in the field of social work. So I work with adolescents, ranging kind of from 16 to like 22, so older adolescents who are in foster care and who are aging out into independence. So yeah, that's my job, and we definitely do have youth that we work with that identify in our community as well.
So my name is Dawn Holt, and the primary reason I'm involved with the LGBTQ community is that I have a gay son. And my son came out when he was 14 years old, so pretty young, and he is now 26, so I've been on this journey for quite a while. My formal connection to the LGBT community is I'm the president of PFLAG Portland, Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, and I'm also the regional director for the Northwest region of PFLAG, for PFLAG National.
My name is Danny. I'm 26.
What gender pronoun do you think of yourself or prefer?
I use she and her.
So do I.
Male.
Trans.
Queer woman.
I identify as a lesbian.
Lesbian. Mm-hmm.
I'm gay. You know, I grew up in the 60s, late 50s and early 60s, and you know, there was very conventional ideas around gender at that point, and there was no visibility of anything gay. So probably the first time I ever heard of anything gay was probably in, you know, when I was like 10 or 11 years old at the earliest, and I can't even remember that actually. I don't even remember the very first reference I heard to anything gay.
I don't feel like I had any role models growing up around sexual orientation, gender identity. Those issues were not discussed in my family or in my community, except in a really derogatory way.
But I do remember always thinking that it was a bad thing, and that it was, you know, an illness or a social problem or something like that.
The messages that I got around gender were very narrow.
Traditional.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Boys were boys and girls were girls, and boys were blue and girls were pink, and boys did sports and girls took home economics, and boys had shop class. And
certain things girls do, there's certain things boys do, there's clothes that girls wear, there's clothes that boys wear. Mm-hmm. I think as a girl I had a little bit more leeway than boys did about sort of gender expression, but sexuality wasn't discussed in any way, shape, or form. It just wasn't, and I certainly didn't know any lesbian or gay people.
I was at a rock and roll show down in San Francisco, and a woman was flirting with me, and in a way that I found kind of obnoxious, and I told her I was gay, and she said, in a way that she thought that she was complimenting me, that, oh, she never would have guessed that I was gay because I don't have like I'm not flaming or I'm not this or I'm not that. And I got angry and I said, that's offensive to me because you're saying that it's okay that I'm gay because I don't conform to your negative stereotypes.
I don't think that I had a lot of queer role models. I also didn't identify as queer until I was older.
I mean, I'm really fortunate in that I had a really extremely open, flexible set of parents. So since we were little, I think the message was always, whoever you bring home will love. It doesn't matter who they are. And the community I grew up in was more rural. So I don't know that was necessarily a community that was very open.
The times were very conventional in that regard. However, things started to shift when I was around 12 or 13 years old, and the whole cultural ferment of the 60s was happening. And I had older sisters who were living in the Bay Area at that point, and I was getting exposed to a lot of politics and countercultural stuff at a very, very young age. And the whole point of that was to rebel from convention. And so I think the first time I would have noticed any break in myself from the norms of what was expected was like in 7th grade was when people started going steady, and everybody had to be going steady, and you would give someone either a little St. Christopher necklace, or if you weren't Christian, you would give them your ID bracelet. But the boy would ask the girl to go steady. It was always the boys that asked the girls, and then you would give them something that would sort of mark them as your steady, And I guess there's something insidious about that in a certain way, but it was part of the ritual of being in 7th grade. But by 8th grade, there was a few of us who, because we had older brothers and sisters who were starting to be more exposed to kind of counterculture and politics, who I think started to kind of pull back from the conventions of the boy-girl stuff, and which was great for me because it took off some of the pressures. The norms of gender roles, we were starting to question those because we were questioning everything else.
I would say that I grew up in a family and community that was supportive of, I would say, gay and lesbian folks. I don't remember hearing about any family friends or people that we knew that were trans or gender non-conforming, and I don't remember being around folks who were queer identified, but did have people in my life that identified as gay or lesbian. There was very much acceptance for those identities.
Never had external manifestations of being a gay boy, so I didn't suffer a lot of the abuse that somebody who was more effeminate or somebody who didn't fit into the male kind of gender norms would have suffered at that time. And there definitely were people that did suffer that stuff.
Have I noticed that language has an impact on my son or other people within the LGBT community that I know? And the answer is unequivocally yes.
I don't like being in a situation where I'm asked what gender pronoun I use, because it's not an issue for me. There's certain things about the language of the gender politics now that I find intrusive. But I understand why it's happening.
And unfortunately, the first examples I can think of are on the negative side. So my son went to public high school. He went to a public high school that was, I think, very conscientious of the very few LGBTQ students that were out, my son being one of them. But still, I don't think a day went by when he didn't hear "that's so gay" in the hall. And that's never a compliment. It's intended to mean less than or other or a synonym for stupid or all sorts of things, but it's not a compliment.
I do think there was less talk about what the word, like the queer community, I think there was less talk about bisexuality. I think I was definitely exposed to like straight and gay, straight and lesbian, where like those were the boundaries and the words, and like you were this or you're that.
And I think especially for LGBTQ young kids or young folks, hearing that day in and day out that's a very difficult message to have to take in repeatedly.
There was less language that really explained the fluidity of what sexuality can look like growing up. It's still been a journey, like into my late 20s and early 30s. I'm trying to figure out like what is the right word that fits who I am and explains it in a way that feels good to me and is understandable to others too.
Then I think about how a lot of younger people in particular have reclaimed the word queer, and how certainly in my generation being queer, that was an insult, no two ways about it. But younger folks have really adopted that term and have made it their own in terms of having it identify not only young people that specifically say that they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, but also youth that just don't feel like they fit within the binary continuums of gender, or that they're either gay or straight. They feel like they fall somewhere in between. And the word queer just does a wonderful job in sort of an umbrella term for all of those young people who don't fit squarely into how society thinks boys and girls should be at this point in time.
In a way, gender expression is the sort of most important external factor here.
I mean, if gender is binary, then the language used to describe it is binary.
In the gay movement, there was this idea, a very strong political insistence that we not be always portrayed in stereotypical roles, but that what that often meant was we don't want to see effeminate gay men, we want to see masculine gay men.
It was the 1970s, and like it was these women and these feminists with the quote unquote burning their bras and being women and fighting the stereotype of what a man looks like, and watching that dynamic between how discriminatory they were against women who were choosing to wear ties and have short hair, and they were like, we're fighting this, you aren't feminists, why do you want to be like a man? And so maybe inherently, I didn't really like think about this. Like, still I hang on to like that idea when I think of like the word lesbian, maybe is this like really separate like feminist issue. And not to say I'm not a feminist, because I am, but it just doesn't, I don't know, it still doesn't feel like it fits.
For example, men, in particular, men who present, either dress or behave or speak or have mannerisms that are more traditionally female, are still to this day, I think, going to be the most subject to discrimination. Overt discrimination and subtle discrimination, because sexuality is not necessarily something people know about, but they see your expression of your gender. And many perceptions are drawn from people's observation of how you express your gender. So a woman who is more traditionally masculine in her expression, or a man who's more traditionally feminine in his expression, I think is really, those are the folks who are subject to overt discrimination regularly.
I still struggle with the idea of drag, because the stereotype that's created by men in drag is always about big, loud women with giant breasts, and they're calling each other, if I may say this, bitches, and it's a negative stereotype of women. I don't necessarily think that it's meant that way by the men who do it, but that's how it comes off to me. And I don't find it funny. I find it offensive.
Really started having queer folks, like queer friends in my life when I was in high school. And I think that was interesting to like have really my first like, your moms were in my life, but in kind of a more removed way. And my mom had a number of friends who were gay, but more removed than the inner circle. And having queer friends in high school, high school is like kind of a really brutal time to be queer. And so those folks like had to fight to be who they were, and to like really put themselves out there, and didn't get any kind of anonymity in high school, and didn't get to hide behind anything. And their whole process like was really on a stage for everybody to see, and like everybody has a really messy process of becoming who they're going to become and figuring out their identities and having their first relationships and all that. But like there were so few out queer people in my high school. It was I think it was one of those high schools where there wasn't the more blatant homophobia and the violence towards queer kids, and yet you really knew that it wasn't okay to be queer,
When there's differences other than gay or straight, then it starts to like blur that. Well, then it, like, I think people start to say, well, then it is a choice. Like, you can choose who you want to be with. And my partner is so great. She just reminds me, like, you can choose who you want to be with, but you still chose to be yourself. And this is who you always were, that you love and accept both genders. So I just am always, like, reminded that every label, even in our, like, broader LGBTQ community, has so much emotion, history, weight, and the way that people choose to associate with that and identify and hear what other, I think even other people will say, oh no, if you're with a woman, you're a lesbian. They're so easy, they want to label you in or out of the community. I just am like acutely aware how much all of those words and all of those labels mean so many different things for each and every person. And so I think like allowing people, I think that's kind of like why I like that ambiguity of like, I think the queer piece, just, you don't have to tell everybody your entire life story. You can just say, I'm proud to be part of this community. This is who I am. And I don't know you that well, stranger on the street. I'm proud to say that I'm part of this community, but I don't need to tell you my whole life story and what that means for me. I can choose to share that with people who are close to me and can hear me and understand me and know me, but I can just, it's a word that I can say, I'm proud of who I am in my community, but I don't have to tell you every little piece of my personal life and story.
I think the reason we still have a lot of the problems that we do in accepting people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender is because we still live in such a patriarchal culture. I think that it's just difficult to not fit neatly into the gender roles that we think people ought to fit into. So if you are a gay man like my son, who's a very sweet kid and growing up didn't want to do a lot of the stuff that guys are supposed to want to do, and got a D in football in middle school because he refused to play. It's okay for girls to bend those rules. It's still really not okay for boys too.
So I identify as queer and I identify as trans, and for me those are two different identities that have had individual processes. I do not identify as somebody who is a trans youth. I think that I was a gender non-conforming youth. I think that I was actually a genderqueer kid. In hindsight, there's kind of this mainstream narrative that trans folks have always been trans, and since the time you were little you remember wanting to be a boy or girl, and this agony over having the wrong body and all this stuff, and I don't have any of those memories. I don't remember ever wanting to be a boy.
Our allies to the LGBT community, I think, have like this special sort of obligation, I don't even see it as a choice, to break down those stereotypes anytime we can. because I'm part of the normative group. You know, I'm straight, I'm white, I'm middle class. The one thing I have is I'm female, but I have all those other privileges. And it really, really is my duty, I think, to do what I can to break down those stereotypes. Because it just shouldn't be that hard for kids. That's just like my bottom line, is it just shouldn't be that hard to grow up in a way that doesn't fit the gender norm.
It should just be allowing of differences, period, in our community. So,
Yeah.
I really want it to be okay for people to be male identified and be completely effeminate.
Because it's the way that
It's what
our
we
values are conveyed.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way that messages are conveyed to you as a child. And I think not even intentionally sometimes. It's that you pick up all kinds of ideas about people's viewpoints and what's good and what's bad from people's language. It's the currency.
It shapes you on every level.
Absolutely.